We are absolutely delighted at LIDC and Hub to welcome Professor Mari Harder. She's a professor at both Fudan University in China and the University of Brighton in the UK, where she is the founder and head of the Values and Sustainability Research Group. She's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Congratulations, Mari. Her work focuses on the elicitation of intersubjective values and practice. So she is very much a global expert in weaving together the social and cultural dimensions into the design of new systems. So here, we have watched Mari as she pulls together interdisciplinary complexity relevant to a specific issue. And in this issue, ours is child stunting, and weaves together and is part of the solution. She is the lead of the shared values theme of the Hub. And today's seminar is entitled Developing Dialogues Through WeValue InSitu. So she will be taking us through this very innovative tool she's created to support local communities and groups in sharing their voices and their values. Welcome, Mari. We are delighted to host you today.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you. Right. So I've got a slightly different title up here. I don't think it matters very much because we're going to cover such broad range. But whether we're talking about dialogues or we're talking about giving groups a clear voice, what I've been pretty busy doing with my teams in the UK, and I also have a team in Fudan University in China, which is actually much more active at the moment. Over the last 10 or 12 years, we've developed a project that started with action research and has led to a tremendous amount of learning on the ground, and has finalized in an approach that we call WeValue, meaning it's what we value. And the particular version we're going to talk about today is called InSitu. So it's WeValue InSitu, where we look at crystallizing, what we call it crystallizing, the shared values that are present in a locality. And it's basically a scaffolding process allowing other people to articulate their own values. So yes, somebody's put up my information. It's true that I trained as a physicist, and I moved over across all subjects, and I'm told now I'm doing something a little bit close to sociology and yes, anthropology, which surprises me, but there we are. Okay, we can move off this slide, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go through these 5 sections. I really want to emphasize that my team is at a turning point right now, a tipping point. We've spent a lot of time developing something. It's taken a tremendous amount of time to formalize it. Because it started with action research and it was very, very grounded, it's taken us a long time to find the different vocabulary we need to formalize it and be able to communicate it to others, which means it's only now becoming something that can be scaled up and rolled out. And we've got such interest from so many fields that's our job in the next 8 months. Is we've got grants to travel around and explain to people what we're doing and do some training, as well as moving faster on the stunting hub and finishing off our deliverables there. So yes, so I'm going to take you through this. So I really want to emphasize that I really would like to hear about anybody who'd like to collaborate in any way, putting in future funding proposals. As you'll see as we go through this, we currently publish in around 7 or 8 different disciplines, and we have some really good theoretical underpinning now, as well as all our practice. So we're really ready to work with other people. So here we go. The first part, go ahead, yeah, is, are we going to have this thing at the top the whole time, or is there any way to get rid of it?
See if we can.
Okay. What is wrong with this picture? Oh, he's moved to the next slide. Sorry. And so he's given you the answer. What is wrong with this picture, everybody? We all know this picture. We think we know it ever so well. And of course, now if you go to the next slide, and you won't be able to see that either, I think. Let's have a look at the next slide. You still have a problem. You can't read the text.
Yeah.
You can put it back at the top. I think you're safer at the top, or the side if you want. The social part of sustainable development or sustainability is not very measurable. It really, really isn't. We are fooling ourselves when we say it is. It's just too intangible. We can do things like look at how many people in the population or the per capita earnings, but it just isn't the same as understanding the people part of people. And so we've kind of overlooked this since it was invented, and it's getting to be the biggest problem, because I think it makes the whole concept of sustainable development unstable. Okay.
We becoming back today.
So we have a fundamental problem with social indicators. Can I get the mouse, or is it too far away?
It's a little far.
Okay. So if we look just at social indicators, you can see that there are some essential criteria, and I'm just going to whiz through it quite quickly. Yeah, just go to the next one. Yeah, I use a lot of pictures. There's another problem where they're used in principles of social value. Social value has to look at what is material, and not necessarily rely on things that already have market value, but the things that are important to people. And those aren't easily measured at the moment. So if you're working on social value, you'll already know there's some problem with the social indicators. Next slide. In SROI, we have another problem. Again, if you look at the middle one, we've got extra financial values where environmental social value is not commonly reflected or involved in conventional financial accounts. So the value is not related to money. And so for social return on investment, SROI, there is a fundamental problem in that category, and it's a big one. Next. If we look at social capital is one of the 5 capitals. It's very popular. It's a nice way to look at things, but it's extremely frustrating to try to actually get a handle on how to measure it, because we can't make it tangible very easily. Counting the number of social organizations is not enough. How do we identify what a social resource is? During the pandemic, it would have been nice to know what would be a way to strengthen society. After the pandemic, with 30–40% of the kids scared to go to school again because they kind of got unused to it. We have a tremendous mental health problem. What are the social resources and values needed to build that up? We don't know. We don't have ways to measure these things. There's something, you can't see the heading here. The heading here is ecological civilization. This is a Chinese principle, which is very, very powerful. If you don't know much about it, it really is well worth looking into. It makes the concept of sustainable development look a little bit primitive, a little bit like kindergarten. Ecological civilization is about the intertwining and the mesh of different aspects of the universe. And they're never split into separate environmental, social, financial. They're always considered intertwined, but it fundamentally has problems of measurement, which are slowly being developed, but it does have a fundamental problem, again, on the social side in particular. Generally speaking, in indicators, there is this problem that we all know what national indicators are. We know what regional indicators are. When you get down to community level, they just don't work. You can't scale down and you can't scale up. There was a lot of interest in this in the 70s, and there were a lot of people who led the way with community indicators, but they never got over the fact that you can spend 6 weeks in one community and get some really good indicators for that community, and then you can't use them anywhere else because they don't work anywhere else. And so they kind of got left behind, and the whole field froze, and there wasn't that much done since then. Okay, you can move to the next slide. So I like to portray this as a kind of universal list versus local list paradox. At the top, I've taken ESG. If you're not familiar with ESG, it's a hugely powerful international system of measurement, a bit like the 3 pillars of sustainable development, but it's used by investment banks. And it's incredibly biased. It's just unbelievably biased and unbelievably bad at measuring anything that's useful. But the thing is, it can measure things, and companies can get some measurements, make a library of them, and then sell their knowledge to other companies and say, I can tell you how well other companies are doing on their ESG. And of course, as long as you can measure something, no matter what it is, and sell it, it will keep being used. However, it's got some incredibly big problems just at this moment, because it's getting bigger and bigger and taking over CSR and other indices. And there's a big tussle at the moment between more or less the capitalist, and in particular American world, who wants, for example, G is governance. They only want the governance within a company to be measured. How much do you do for your disabled people? How much do you have on inclusivity? And this is absolutely zero consideration of the interface of a company with the local governance of the people it's doing things in. The environment is biased. It measures things like carbon footprints, which makes countries who are producing a lot look bad and countries that are importing stuff already made look better. So at the moment, there's a big tussle going on about how this should measure and what it should measure. And up here, I've put only the social dimension. And I'm doing this just to give you an idea of the titles that are used in ESG. And what I'm trying to say is, if you take any universalist at all that's being used around the world, and in a moment, I'm going to show you some others, and you look at what they say they're measuring and what they're trying to actually go out and measure in terms of CO2 footprints per dollar or whatever, and you compare them to the bottom. Now, at the bottom, I've got local stakeholders or local people or local groups, and they might be interested in a completely different type of values that don't fit into a rigid box. And they might be things like, we really, really value non-corrupt leadership, or we really, really value personal development and a chance to be the best that we can be, or we really, really value our eyesight being protected. So these are things that might be incredibly important to local stakeholders. And when you look at those kind of topics and you compare them against the international frameworks, there's just this huge mismatch. There's a complete gap. There's just no way you're going to bridge that gap. And so I say it's so big, it's fundamentally different. It's a fundamental paradox. How do you match the two? You need a bridge. And let me give you an example. If we take a universal concept like, well, the examples are human capabilities, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the Human Development Index, they all have this same problem. Whatever the list says universally, you can say, oh, human rights are nice, and everybody will nod their heads. And then you say, and this is what it should look like everywhere in the world. And you'll get a lot of people saying, absolutely not. That is not what it looks like in my country. And I want to give you an example. So here's the HDI with its three main dimensions. And there's been so many disagreements about how to measure them that they're paired back to just one core indicator for each one of them. So for health, the indicator used is life expectancy at birth. And for standard of living, it's the gross national income per capita. And for education, it's the number of years of schooling to 25, age of 25. Now, let me show you what this might look like locally. Locally, we were in Nepal a few weeks ago. And if you even mention something about life expectancy at birth, they would be horrified. They don't talk about things like that. Just to talk about it would be inviting disaster. You do not mention things like this, much less go around measuring. Standards of living. If you looked at the gross national income per capita, some people would say that is a measure, that's not a measure of standard of living, that's a measure of capitalist perversion. That's what they would say it's a really good measure of locally in some parts of the world. Education. In New Zealand, with the minority groups there, I think that they would say if you force our kids into a white guy's school, that's a measure of colonial oppression. That's not a measure of education as far as we're concerned. And then you could turn the question around and say, well, what would it look like in your own frame? So if you then, and they might say, well, health, what else do you want to measure health by except whether or not you live to see your grandchildren? That's what you measure health by. What do you measure as a standard of living? The number of children we can afford. That might be a good measurement in some countries, some places. Education might be measured by the number of chapters of the Quran my son has studied. That would be maybe a good measure of education. And so you have this really, really deep paradoxical problem, which is that the universalists need a bridge between them and local sites. And this is not about simplifying and paring down and making easier to understand what the international guys want to say. This is not about spelling it out in baby language. It's not about participating with stones and pebbles in boxes. This is not what it's about. It's about fundamentally accepting that there's a different vocabulary, a different way of viewing the world, and they don't match doing it this way. So, by the way, we have done a bit of work. I'm not going to go into it. It's a side study that I won't emphasize today, but it's worth mentioning that we have done a study with some philosophers looking at the nature of the paradox, the nature of why there is an impasse and the characteristics required to break it. But I'm not going to go into that today. Next. So it's a bizarre thing that when you're working in lots of different fields it's really hilarious when you find that there's somebody somewhere working in a corner of academia who's actually cracked a problem and nobody's ever heard of them. And this is the case here. There are a bunch of engineers working on remediated land. And what they do is they go around the world trying to fix really bad problems with contaminated land. And they propose several different projects to local people and getting engineers to develop these projects. And these remediated land engineers have realized that they can't have a project successful. They'll get too much protest over it and it just won't do the job unless they take into account very carefully the local situation. So they've ended up developing something that to them, it seems absolutely normal, but what they've done is actually quite unique as far as I've seen. Next. So this is the Surf Bridge. They're called Surf UK. There's actually different versions of Surf, but the UK is used the most. And they have these series of steps. You've got to prepare and set your objectives and contact the stakeholders and assess your boundaries and so on. So they've got their engineering steps. And in the middle of them, they've got a triple layer of indicators that the assessor has to go out and find out locally. And of course, being Western based, they base it on the United Nations threefold pillars of sustainable development without very much integration. So you've got your kind of social, economic, and environmental indicators, but they have a really, really important caveat. If you look at the bottom of the slide, it says the default, we give you default indicators, but they should be localized. If at all possible, you should localize them. And this means you should edit them to be appropriate. If they're not appropriate indicators, edit them, remove irrelevant ones, and add in missing ones. And so they've insisted this from the beginning. But even with that, even with all those caveats, they've had a repeated and ongoing problem with social indicators. So they've actually chucked everything they can think of into the social indicators part, health and safety, everything that didn't fit anywhere else, they've chucked it into social because they really didn't know what to do with social. But basically what they're suggesting is if you can input some localized indicators there, which we know is going to be difficult for the social dimension, the indicator system itself, the entire decision-making tool is ready for it. All you have to do is pop them in. And then what they do is they say, okay, having got these indicators, here's 4 different possibilities. We could, I'm going to show you an example in a minute where in Nigeria, where there was a lake that wasn't being used and it was a salt lake producing salt. And they said we could either leave it as it is, business as usual. We could produce salt, we could produce lithium, or we could have a hotel there. So you get your different scenarios and you rank them against the score they get on all these indicators. So you've got the green, yellow, blue indicators, and you score those 4 scenarios and you work out which one is best. So they might all be bad or they might all be good, but you just go for the best one. As you can see, when it says input localized indicators here, but they still have this problem with the social and they need it in innovation. So what you need is a localization process, which it goes around and tries to understand the local people, but then you can input your localized indicators. And that's where finally I can tell you the work that we do. So here's an example. We went to about 11 village groups near the lake, the Salt Lake in Nigeria. This is an example of the men. And what we have is this crystallization process where we ask the men in this group, what's important to you being members of this group? What's worthwhile to you in your life, in the aspect of your life that's overlapping with what you do in this group? Worthwhile, meaningful, valuable, that kind of nexus of things. Because we find that naturally forming groups are really where it's at. Naturally forming groups, people go to because they want to be with them. And it's where if they don't want to be with this group, they tend to then go away and they're not in the group. So if you look at the shared values of naturally forming groups and you look at enough of them, you can get quite interesting glimpses of the shared values that are active in the locality. So each group works out step by step, which I'm going to show you in a moment, statements of things that are important to them. And they then write out these statements and then there's another step where they put them in, link them to each other in a framework. And the statements and the frameworks are completely unique. They're completely bespoke. and they are totally controlled by the local people. And I'll show you how we give them a framework, but we don't actually input to them the content. Yeah. So this is the WeValue InSitu approach. Here's the kind of schematic of it. It used to take a day. Over the years, we've managed to get it down to 2 hours. It depends a lot on the size of the group. You can't have two, you could have a big group, it'll just take a lot longer. We tend to do about 5 or 6 or 7 people, can even be 10 sometimes, in an hour and a half, 2 hours. So the first step is we just ask them to tell us who they are in the room. So by doing this, they automatically work out while they're speaking who they are. So, but of course, we're also very, very careful who we've invited. So they may be the single men's group of a village, or the married mothers group of a village, or the vendors, merchants in a market, or it could be school teachers. So they introduce each other and they automatically kind of form a boundary around who they are. We then ask them to start giving examples of what's meaningful to them in the photo elicitation stage. Actually, it's perhaps a misnomer because it's not photo elicitation, it's photo conveyancing. So they use photos to help them convey what they mean about why, no, not yet, why they're in the group. We then have, after they finish this section, we have a trigger list, which can be written down or it can be read out. We've got lots of variations of it, of how it can be delivered. But this trigger list are statements of people in that locality that they've said is important to them, what's important to them in their own groups. And the reason we do this is we provide anywhere from 60 to 120 statements, depending on how the group can manage it. And they kind of act as a trigger, or we call it Haagen-Dazs. I call it the Haagen-Dazs effect. If you thought you liked vanilla ice cream and then you suddenly go to Haagen-Dazs and realize that you were actually a pineapple coconut sorbet person, but you've never tried it before. So we need a range of ideas that you can see and you can be exposed to, that you can then suddenly say, oh, I resonate with this. I'm pineapple coconut, and you circle it and you get it ready for discussion. Then we have this collective exploration step where everybody discusses with each other. They explain why they've seen a phrase or a sentence or an idea that made them think about something that was valuable and meaningful to them about being in the group. And somebody else gives another example, and somebody else gives, and they start talking about which bits of these things are important to them. And they slowly work out what they want to focus on and what they want to write down. And they write down the statement and they put a statement down. And then after the very end, we collect those and they show them how they're related. So that's the basic WeValue InSitu approach. There's a lot to it. I'm going to tell you a little bit more as we go along, but this is your overview. So what do we find out? What kind of things do people say? Well, really interesting statements. Look at this. We have a chance. Each of this starts with the words, it is important to us. So it's important to us that we have a chance to make something bigger than ourselves. It's important to us that everyone is kind to each other. It is important to us that we are fair and considered equal in many ways. These are kind of statements we get all over the world, and they are different, but it's interesting how different they are from, say, a management assessment package in a company. Actually, there's quite a bit of overlap. If you look at the last two, they come from the Nigerian example. It's important to us that we prize eyesight. We want to carry it into old age. These people in Nigeria were very aware that they did not want to be old and not be able to see. And so it didn't really matter if they were talking about it as single men in the single men's group or the older leaders of the village group. Several of them mentioned how important eyesight was to them. They also mentioned the next one. It's important to us that the lake is a deity. Only local women can touch the lake. Well, my goodness, if you're about to do a development of the lake, it would be kind of important to know that, wouldn't it? Right, next slide, please. So these might sound trivial and unnecessary to document, but neglecting them can lead to some really serious problems. Like this example is it's Myanmar, isn't it? Yeah, or Laos, yeah. It was a Chinese project where the Chinese companies were invited in to construct a dam for some hydropower. And it stopped 2 years later after a lot of protests with a loss of 7 billion yuan in the early stages. And then every year was another loss of 300 million yuan. So you had a situation where leaders and companies made agreements and went in to start work, and local people's wishes and what was important to them about their life there was not taken into account, and you had a failure. So it is worth taking these things into account. It's something that ESG really wants to get a hold of right now. It's something that Surf UK already tries. And this is to remind you, where were we? On the right, you can see the WeValue InSitu process. So we can take those frameworks that the different little groups in the village made, the frameworks of their statements. And depending on how much time we have, those statements can be very concise. They can be so concise, you can actually stick them straight into an indicator system. So you could stick into this indicator system, it's important that only the women touch the lake. And you can stick into this indicator system, our eyesight should be protected. And you've automatically got two really powerful, heavily weighted criteria with which to judge the local projects that you probably would never have thought of without doing a bit of local work. So now it can go in and go into this kind of a bridge, a bit like Surf UK's bridge. And so, yeah, there it's just showing you going into the blue indicators. And then if we actually rate there are the indicators in gold are the new ones that got put in the next slide. It actually made a difference to the rating and the order of the four. You can see the WeValue version and the non-WeValue version. The ratings changed slightly. And there's a paper written on this. You can look it up. Google Scholar's got all my papers, and this one is a Nigerian study. Yeah. So I just want to use a slightly different diagram to show you something here that basically we've got one local stakeholder group, and it has told us that there are things that are important to it. So from the bottom looking up, the kind of things it needs measuring are something about religion, forest, children, jobs, and traditions. And the red shows you that we're talking about group A. Next slide. Now the red group is over there on the left, and you've got lots of other groups. So we can go to lots of groups in a locality, and we can pull together in a very careful way of synthesizing. It's not complicated, but you just have to realize you're dealing with values, not dollars. And you can aggregate the shared values or the cultural schema, some people might call it, for an area. So now you've got N local stakeholder groups, yeah. And you can build that up and produce a kind of cultural profile of the locality, which is, it's not wishy-washy, it's reasonably well defined or well detailed. Yeah, next. And you could actually build this up into a kind of universal ESG list or a bridging list. So what we're talking about basically is building up the universal list from the bottom, not from the top. Yeah. And in actual fact, you can easily then link it to something like the ESG social dimension. You've got the different blue arrows there pointing down, and you can link them. Should I just pause there? I heard a bell. Is that related to us? No. Okay.
My computer logged.
Oh, okay, fine. Really what I've tried to do now is something that most of the people in the Stunting Hub maybe haven't seen before, is linking what I'm doing to a kind of much bigger issue, this bigger question. Yeah, next slide. So now I was going to pause and take you into some more details about the actual process. But shall I stop and just see if there's any questions? And also I'm curious whether we've got anyone new who might have missed something. So it looks like we still have the same people here. So we haven't had too many new people.
We have this person shared.
She knows us quite well. And then we have, okay. And okay, not too bad then. We were worried we would have a lot of new people who maybe we would need to repeat some stuff for, but I think we're okay. Does anybody have any questions? Shall I take a few questions first? Because it's going to get, it's probably good for a break and a time to have a think for a minute anyway. Any questions in the room?
It's a bit of an abstract question.
Yeah.
But where you have the pictures, where you're doing the images, when you're doing the thing with the images on the table, there's one with a hedge that looks like a hedge maze, and one that looks like a shell with the spiral. What do they represent?
It's whatever they want to represent. And when the session is over, if we have enough time, I'd be happy to do. Oh, I don't think we could do a quick session and you could try it out and see what happens. I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go along.
Lovely.
Yeah. But they're usually quite bespoke. Although if we're in a hurry, we give people a rough idea of how to do it, and then because otherwise it can take them about an hour to work out how to do it. What do you mean? We had a really interesting one here in this room about 4 years ago. I'll have to look it up with some of the hub theme leads. It was a very interesting one.
We have one more question.
Oh, yes, we have a question. Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, we don't have a question. Oh, we have Christy.
Yeah, sorry. I had a question about the WeValue InSitu approach. I worked in my research here. We worked with the concept mapping of Frochim. Maybe you know it also because it has some similar patterns, no? Also kind of generating statements. Only if I understood well, the statements that you present here to the group are not generated by that group, no? That are statements that you have collected previous to the workshop you have with those 8 to 10 people, no?
That's correct. We generate that list by having about 6 or 8 interviews in the locality 2 weeks before we get there. Yeah. And we have a special way of developing it. The list is quite special, actually. I once had an educationist come up to me very excited, and I thought they were going to ask me about my results or something, and all she said was a big leadership fellow professor, and she said, no, she said, I just want to know, how did you know how to get the list? Because she thought if you have the right list, you can get people to generate the correct responses or useful responses. So yes, we generate it in the local language with local researchers in anywhere except maybe globalized communities. If they're very globalized communities, we can use a globalized list. It doesn't seem to bother them very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Interesting.
There were a few more people who joined us. Do you want to quickly check?
Any other questions? Pravid Sasari, do you want to tell us anything about, we got somebody, Anthony's raised his hand, and then maybe Pravid Sasari, you can just tell us, everyone's told each other where they're from. So maybe you can tell us in just a moment, but Anthony, go ahead with your question.
Hello, it's so partly a comment. About 15 years ago, I was in New Zealand working in local government, and I was part of a project with the statistics agency for the country to look at linked indicators, as they called it, to link up the national to the local. So you mentioned on the universal and sort of the global level, the link and the gap between that and local. Well, in New Zealand, there was even a gap between national and local indicators, whereas there were some parts of legislation where city councils reported on various activities, not just financial accounts, but also some outcomes. And individual government departments, such as the health department, education ministry, and so on, also reported. And the statistics agency for the country was looking at a range of initiatives that were being done in Europe with UN Economic Agency for Europe, also in the OECD, and various other places that were looking at sustainable indicators or indicators of quality of life or well-being. So it was an interesting project, but didn't get very far. So I think it's really great that you've found something that can kind of crack and try and bridge the gap between global, universal, and the local. So I think it's a really, really good initiative that you were telling us about.
Thank you. That must have been right about when our first project was funded. It was a European Commission project where the European Commission was very aware that civil society groups do huge amounts of good work in Europe, but they're not scientists and they're not necessarily scientific. And in fact, they're held back by formalities. So the European Commission said our science funding should include work that will assist civil society. So they had a special fund which was for supporting civil society, and that's what we were funded from. and it was originally in the category of sustainability indicators. And what we said we were going to try to do was to understand how civil society groups could be evaluated in a manner which they found valid. So they would say, you know, we do really good work, and then the funder comes along and asks us how many kids, how many schools, how many trees did we plant? And it's not fair. That's just not fair. That's not what we're doing. We're emotionally connecting kids to nature. We shouldn't be measured with those things. And we'd say to them, okay, so what would you like to be measured on? Said, I don't know. I don't know. And there was this complete lack of clarity or articulation. And we started to work with lots of different groups on it, really going native and working on the ground. And we found after 2 years, it could be done, but you had to start with a framework that was ground-based, not top-down. So that was right about the same time. And yes, a lot of projects just died at that point. And we're only now at the point, I mean, the trouble is if you do action research, you know, and you go native, if you then have to publish papers, they don't fit anywhere. I mean, we've got a psychologist in the audience today. You can't match this to psychology very well. You can't match it with standard sociology. You can't match it with sustainability indicators. It's really, really hard. My poor PhD students cry at night because they have to learn entirely new languages in order to publish what we're doing in different journals. But we keep trying. Yeah. They're tough cookies. Okay.
Can I just add one more thing? Yeah, there were some academics involved in some related initiatives. One was Marilyn Waring, and she produced from Massey University in New Zealand. She looked at progress indicators and including things like women's work and the problem with GDP excluding work in the home, caring for people, as well as a whole wide range of things. So yeah, I went to a couple of her classes. It was quite interesting. Certainly a very important development. So I think it's great that you're bringing it back to things, and hopefully government agencies will get keener to help fund these projects in future.
I think it's likely to get funded by or more developed by businesses before ever a government. I mean, I don't know if you've ever heard of Tim Jackson, who's a professor at Surrey University. He wrote a fantastic book called Prosperity Without Growth, I think it's called. He was allowed to lead a Sustainable Development Commission by the British government, and he started advocating that instead of getting on the train and going to London and earning a lot of money and coming back late at night, and paying for your kids to go to a private school because the local schools were no good, and paying for your parents to go to a private nursing home because the local ones were no good, if you forgot all that and you just work locally and try to develop the local the economy, your kids could go to the local school. You wouldn't need to have such a high salary for all these other things. And so he developed very, very sound entire platforms of work building up to explain why this idea would work. And it's the only time I've ever heard of the government pulling the plug on a group. He lost all his funding. He was asked to stop preaching this message, and they were told this kind of economics will sink the country. Don't do it anymore. And he had to stop that project. He's now got a completely different one in social science. But if you read that book, it caused tremendous excitement in Europe. It was really related to the what was that report? Stiglitz's report, printed about the same time. So there were some really exciting things happening 12 to 15 years ago, really exciting. But what we're finding actually, and I'm going to come to this at the end of the talk, is the banks pushing ESG and the companies terrified of the risk involved in going into countries where you don't understand the people. They've approached us indirectly through others and are asking us to see if we can develop this for them. So I don't think governments would be that interested, actually. Not enough in it for their mates, right? Okay. So now I'd like to talk a little bit more about the actual process, which is actually what we've spent a lot of time understanding, because you can't train new facilitators without really understanding the process well, and it's taken us a really long time to do that. Is it okay if I continue, or anybody else want to come in for anything? There's 6 chats. Do we need to check what the chats are saying? You're right.
Christine, some comment. Yeah.
Oh, someone's even recommending a journal. Great. Oh, super. Equity Health, guys. So we'll pick that up later. Wonderful. Thank you. Always tough on journals. Somebody's saying something about donors. When we first were successful with this, we went to funders, we went to philanthropic institutions, and their attitude was, we don't need to know about this. If the people we're donating to are interested, they can do it. But we would like it for our own institution, perhaps, because we've got basically a war going on between the people running, say, the big multinational corporations, and then the people on the phone who have to do nothing more than figure out a way to get money out of people on the other end of the phone. And the difference in the ethics between what was portrayed and on the ground, I mean, you basically had a civil war going on inside some of these organizations. And what they wanted to know was, could it be used to understand their own staff? And then they realized that they really didn't need to know this information. So all that work, we did go to donors back in the early days. Now we're just working on building a strong platform and getting more people trained so that they can go out and use it, because it's useful in so many fields. Right. Okay, let's look at the process. Here we go. So basically on the left, you can see a group of people that hang out together some of the time anyway, and they don't really necessarily know why. So they could be farmers who cut rice together, or they could be a team in a multinational wealth management company. It doesn't matter who they are. And what our process does is it helps that group understand what all the different pieces are of what's important to them, right? So I've shown you this before, just have a quick note of the points. We've got the contextualization stage, a photo conveyancing or elicitation, a trigger list, a lot of collaborative explorations, and then finally a framework, right? So what we basically do is we now think of this as taking the team, the whole group, down into the tacit zone. So we need them to talk about examples. So what we've got there is a dot going down representing from the y-axis is kind of explicit, talking about something, going down to examples. So they may say, what's important to me in being in the men's village group is I get bored of being in the village, and I can talk to the other men about things that we might do when we go to the city next time. And they start giving examples, and they pull these examples out of tacit. And so the facilitator has to encourage everyone to go down and talk about examples into the tacit zone. And what I've shown in the diagram trying to convey is the bottom left is, one person's gone down and said, I'm talking vaguely about this area. But because it's a shared experience. We've arranged the group to make sure that they have shared experiences. Some person number 2, which I've shown beneath it, comes in and says, yeah, well, I know what you mean. And he'll say something like, oh yeah, it's a bit like, you think you want to get to the city, and then when you finally get into the city, you forgot what you're there for. So he's given the blue coloring within, he's identified this area of overlap with the first person. And then a third person comes in and says, well, I think it's a bit more like this. And he kind of shapes it and says, it's a bit more like this bit. And you can see the blue color's got straight edges. And then when they finally worked out about what it is that's important to them about going to the city and being together in a group, the facilitator says, okay, so, you've identified something that's meaningful to you. How would you express it? Should we start trying to express it in different ways? And then they try to express it, and then the facilitator says, is that really what you mean? And then they kind of reword it, and as they reword it, of course, these are all processes of meaning making, very particular types of meaning making. And they finally get to the point where they get more and more explicit until they've written down a statement which says it's important to us that, and then whatever they've got to say, and they write it out on a piece of paper and put it in the middle of the table, and that's their first statement. So this is basically the concept. This is at the kind of sorry, it's mislabeled. It's not macro level. This is kind of the meso level. Yeah. So this is an example of the photo elicitation stage. So as I say, I've got to relabel these. It's actually photo conveying. We're not trying to trigger them with the photos. The photos have no meaning assigned to them, but we ask people what's important to you in this group, think about it, and then go and get a photo to help you explain it. So somebody in Indonesia picks this photo. This was a mother's group in East Lombok, which is a really not very well off, quite poor, strongly Muslim, practicing, worshipping, unity and worshipping society. And the first participant says, I would like to tighten up the bond between parents and kids, because this is really important for the baby, for the kids. It's really important to show our love and passion as a complete vision, as mother and father, because I see some families who's unfortunate because the parents are separated, so he's lacking in giving compassion to the kids. This is really important for the future because the parents' guidance is really, really important to the kids. They need to be close to each other. So this person has gone way deep, talked deeply about something that's important to her about being a mother in East Lombok with the other mothers, and has used the photo to try to convey it. Next slide. So in the next part of so everybody does that. You go around the room and everybody's listening, and it's about deep listening and one at a time. And then they look at the trigger statements, which have been developed for them locally. And somebody has picked this one. They said, oh, I want to talk about this trigger statement, number 76. It says it's important to us that we stick together as a family no matter what happens. And then she talks about it, no matter what happens, we're going to perform as a family. It's important, something. And then there's some discussion about, well, what does forgiveness mean? What does compassion mean? And the group says, well, I think it means this. No, I think it's slow. Well, here's an example. They come back and they say, well, we're not going to repeat over and over again about the mistake that he already did, because we're going to keep the family as one, united. And so the facilitator says, oh, really? Well, what do you mean by united? And are you sure that's the word you want? And so then they have a lot of discussion about what they mean. And then finally, they get to the final. They go through different versions of the statement, and it comes out and it says, it's important to us that family is highly valued because it is the source of encouragement and motivation in life. So this group has worked out what they then later take all these statements, and we ask them to arrange them to show in a way that will show the linkages between the different statements. So you never know how they're going to link, and this is how they've shown them. And then for illustration, we ask them to put the photos nearby, but it's really the framework that's important. And there's the one little statement is just there. So that whole process of meaning making, which took some time, is that one statement that's pointed to by the red arrow. And when they finish making this framework on the table, we ask somebody to stand up and give a narrative, and they have to explain, how would you explain this to mothers in India or in Senegal? How would you explain what you mean by this framework? And so they've started at the top. And I'll just read you a little bit and then stop. I just want you to get a feel for, this is the data output. So this is one set of data. It's from one group, which is of mothers of young children in East Lombok. And it's like a portrait. And this is what it says. It says, oh, I have to change my glasses. It says the foundation of what they want to show, the foundation of what's important to us, is that a mother should be able to sacrifice her life for her kids, and that the mother would like to have a kid who's useful for her society. Happiness is the most important to kids, and the ability to survive. All right, they're not talking about going to a good school. They're saying the ability to survive is at the heart of everything, because we need to will in life struggle. So mothers need to support the kids. It's important to us that a mother makes sacrifice for her child, and it's important to us that we value our children and do not neglect them. And then the kids' happiness comes from good living conditions. So the mothers are saying it's their job. It's their job to provide those living conditions. Education and the home. Therefore, it's important to us that we respect elderly people. And it's important to us that the children know the Arabic letters in order to read the Quran. And it goes on. So basically, you can see that after an hour and a half with these mothers, we have a portrait of them. And it tells you something about them, but it also tells you a lot about kind of background cultural schema, I think would be a closest word to use, in case you want to then ask yourself, what kind of health intervention shall I do for stunting? Or what kind of support could I give these mothers for educating their children? It doesn't directly answer the question, but it gives you background information. Okay. So that's going back to this, that's the overview again. Go next slide. Yeah. So just to show you, basically, so there's a process on the left, and I'm showing you the data on the right in the box. So this is the immediate output, is the framework and the narrative that comes with it. And it involves going into tacit knowledge, making meaning of it piece by piece, and then articulating these statements. Right, next. Yeah, so you basically get an envelope of what's important to the members of the group. And I stress envelope. So basically, they have chosen, it's naturally emerged how they choose to emphasize or which aspects they make statements out of. And there's all the unspoken things in between the statements. But instead of saying to them, imagine, you know, a psychologist coming in and saying, here's Schwartz values. I want to see where honesty and integrity is on your, you know, could you scale it for me, please? And them saying, what do you mean by that? Oh, don't worry, just fill in the questionnaire. Okay. We are not saying, trying to understand people on the basis of an external framework. We're saying, you decide the framework. And the framework, their framework is based on these statements, and the way that they relate to each other tells you a lot about other things. They've thrown away many, many words and many, many ideas that are not present in the final framework. So the framework itself represents what's important to this group. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know why that's there. We've already done that. Oh, I think it's because I'm trying to tell you more about, if you go even deeper, even more deeply, we've analyzed this at different levels. So the tacit explicit can, sorry, just go back up once. These concepts, the very rough idea of tacit and explicit can be obtained from Polanyi's personal knowledge theory, if you want to look at that at all. It's just a very basic level of it. Next one. If you go into it more deeply, Polanyi talks a lot about all the different microprocesses that a person goes through. If you give them new knowledge and they're trying to make sense of it, make meaning of it, they have to kind of compare it to what they know inside them. And there are a lot of little tiny steps that a person does before they do this. And then they kind of compare, they do a constant comparison, which of course is the foundation of all learning. They compare it to something else they know, and then they look at it a different way, and they might try to articulate it, and so on. So there's a whole process of taking information in before you settle down and decide you're happy with it, or you know where it's going to reside. And it's the same when you try to take something out. So if you want to express something that you think you know inside and you're trying to say it, it has to go through several steps, whereby you bring it out and you think, is that what I meant? And then you go back and you bring it out again. And so you have these oscillations between tacit and explicit. And there are many microprocesses, and we actually have taken Polanyi's microprocesses and followed line by line the discussions and negotiations that are in our process. And the process was that, because we can then think of the process this way, the facilitators have been able to standardize the process much more, and we can actually train a facilitator to know what they're trying to do. They're trying to go down into the tacit, and sometimes you're trying to just keep them in the tacit. Sometimes you're moving them up, and we can understand this in terms of cycles of meaning making. So on the bottom right of there on the white, you can see large cycles of meaning making where people are trying to understand something and they go back down. This is as a group, and then they finally go to the uppermost level, which is the most explicit. And the one above just shows a different type of way of analyzing it. Next. This is our latest analysis where everything on the bottom, the whole bottom sets of rectangles represent one person. And all the ones above him floating in the air are the other people in the group. And basically we can think about the microprocesses going on in one person, and the other people are stimulating him. So as he listens to the others, it's causing him to rush down to tacit and have a think and come back and compare and think about what is being said. This is an actual conversation. This is and then we were able to then find that there is a moment at which the person shifts. They shift what they understand, and you have the seed of a transformation in their perception, or a transformation in their way of viewing the world. And what's interesting, you can't see it very well in this case, but in this particular case, when the person at the bottom shifted, which is about 3/4 of the way through, when they actually had a shift, everybody else that had been listening and working out his problem with him and kind of angsting over the same problem, they suddenly realized that they also could resolve it with the way he resolved it. And so they suddenly all resolved it together. And so the whole group came to a new meaning. In this case, it was a village group in, this is Botswana, right? Botswana, where one member of the village leaders said, a trigger statement said it's important for us to take care of the environment. And people said, no, it's important for us to take care of the village. And somebody else said, yeah, but the environment's not the same as a village. And somebody, yes, it is. It's the same thing. And so they then had this an extended discussion about what was the environment and what was the village and were they the same or not. And they finally decided that they needed to think of them separately. And the moment at which they decided, actually, we need to do them both. And everyone else said, yeah, actually, I think you're right. And they all settled down. And this led to what people who publish in Sustainability Science Journal call a system level transformation, because the group then went on to decide that they were going to really attack the production of a local adaptation plan for climate change. And they did a really good job of it. And we've done a study of that. We did an exploration first, and then we did a quasi-experiment where 4 villages did WeValue before being asked by the government to do their local adaptation plan, and 2 that didn't. And the adaptation plans that came out after WeValue were tremendously more higher quality. And they really took ownership, and they believed it was highly relevant to them, and they really grabbed and produced their own local plan. So that was just an example. Yeah. Okay. So to kind of go back to a helicopter view, you've got this process and it produces the box, it produces the outputs in the box. And once you've got those outputs and you've got that profile that we talked about, the dotted line shows you that planners who are planning anything, they could be planning a park, or they could be planning a new development in the Salt Lake. They've now got a better understanding of the local perspectives and preferences and the cultural schema. It can't actually measure. So when the group didn't know who they were, you can't measure that. There's a bloke there, an outside government guy trying to measure. Even when they kind of had worked out a little bit about who they were, you can't measure it. But when the participants have written out statements and put them into a framework, you can start measuring. And you also can tell which ones are most important just by the way they talk about them in the narrative. It's very clear which ones are really, really important. So that means we can now do measures. So every single one of those statements becomes a proto-indicator, which can be refined. And we've done this in lots of examples. So if you want to see examples of these, we can give them to you later. I think a really good one is we worked with an international, well-known humanitarian aid organization, their headquarters in Hong Kong, and the teams worked out their own 2-year monitoring and evaluation plan on the basis of the statements they made in their program. And the bosses decided they weren't quite so happy with that. They wanted their own external ones as well. So they compromised and had a mixture of the two. And you don't have to measure everything every month or every year. They could decide that this year we're going to emphasize these things that are important to us, and these other things are important to us. What was particularly interesting about that example was one of the things that came out very strongly was that these workers in this aid organization, it was incredibly important to them that they got satisfaction out of being volunteers. And yet their organization had a fundamental principle that you were not allowed to have this kind of satisfaction. It was really bizarre, but they felt that if you were attached to it, it would stop you from being a good volunteer. And so we actually had a very delicate situation where it came out very strongly from the staff, but they knew that if the bosses saw it, they would not be so happy. So they kind of rephrased it before they put it in a report. That's interesting. Okay. Yes, and so then you can, in the middle one shows you that you can just make lots of different indicators. You can roughly measure something, or you can measure it 3 different ways. You can do a triangulation on it. You can decide to measure one thing more than others, whatever. On the right, we show that you can also just put them straight in, usually almost straight in, to a decision support tool. It can be a very standard one, like the engineers were using for sustainable land remediation. It can be ESG, it could be GRI. Yeah, okay. Right, just stop there, just go back actually and just check if there's any questions or anyone want to make any comments. And I don't want to give you fatigue. I mean, I can actually stop right now. We don't need to go any further. Yeah.
Someone said that.
No, someone's had to go away. And it has been about an hour, hasn't it? Yes.
Oh, we have Dr. Subbaraw joining us.
Oh. I'm not quite sure where. Oh, let me just do a little bit more to get to the hub. What I'm doing with the hub, and then we can stop, I think. You want to continue then? I'm going to push on, guys, until I get to the bit about what I'm doing with the hub, and then I can stop and see if people want to leave. Another thing we can do is use the shared values as a lens. So how do we do that? Basically, once this group has clarified who they are to themselves, they've crystallized their own in situ values to themselves, they're now on the table. And we get a lot of shock. We get a lot of people saying, oh, I think one we hear quite often is, how did you get me onto the table? And there's often we have to schedule a pause, because people just, when they suddenly see it on the table, it's like, yes, it's true, but I wouldn't have said it, but I did say it, but we didn't mean it. Yes, we did mean it. How did it get on the table? And we need to give them a minute, more than a minute, to come to terms with the fact that it's now written down on the table. Once people have done this, what's happened is they suddenly are very, very clear. They've got a raised self-awareness, which is articulated, of what is important to them. And for some bizarre reason, which we're still exploring, if you now ask them about almost any topic, nothing to do with the topic you've just talked about, if you ask them, what do you think of the health services? Or do you have any safety concerns at work? Or what do you think of this new invention? They can just rattle it off, as long as as long as it's something they've had some experience with. You can't ask them about something about, technology on the moon or something. So they just come out with all sorts of information on a topic that you can bring up. So you can now hold what you might think of as a focus group, but it's a focus group with a difference, because they are just absolutely brimming with energy and desire to articulate and an ability to articulate. And so you can say to them, so what we did for the hub, for the stunting hub, is to ask questions about your daily home activities. So we would ask the mothers, can you take us through your day? Where do you go shopping? What kind of food do you buy? All these things. And they would just rattle it off. And we were kind of desperately trying to make notes fast enough. And they then tell you huge amounts of information about their lives. And you can, as they're talking, of course, you can see many things that are relevant to their children being stunted. But you can also see the links between what they're talking about and their shared values. So continue. So you have the first part that I've told you about, and we now have a second thing, which is like a focus group. Because it's different, we call it a perspectives exploration, or PEX for short. So we now have two sets of data. Go ahead again. Oh, okay. So this is we have two sets of data, one from the first and the second from the focus group. Yeah. So this is the Action Against Stunting Hub that Claire is the director of, and you all know about this, I think. Yes, next. And the Stunting Hub uses a whole child approach, and it's got all these health experts. We've got, what have we got? Immunes, genomic, anthropometry, cognition, parental influences. We've got epigenetics and gut health and worm people and food safety and food environment and micronutrition, all sorts of experts. And we have education experts who are there to understand the varying stages of cognition of people with different extents of stunting. And what my team's job is to understand the shared values running through all of these. So we were the ones that have to come and say kind of, what can we learn about the people? Who's focusing on the people? That's us, yeah. So you've seen this, how we get this kind of information. Go ahead. So basically, we start asking them, tell me about your day with the children. And they say, oh, we probably can't afford to buy some favorite foods. We'll make it by ourselves. At auntie's house, they take a bath and maybe they'll even eat there. They're telling us all sorts of things, some of which are related to stunting and children's food or stimulation. Yeah. So basically, they're seeing this through the lens of what they've already told us. So they're saying things like, at the first, the children need to be able to read the Quran. They talked a lot about children being collaborative. The children need to learn to work in groups, yeah. And if you look at something like, this is just a very rough diagram. This is not true. It was just kind of a rough network, interlinkages of different factors that might lead to stunting. So at the very far right, you can see infant growth and infant cognition and behavior, which might be measures or descriptions of stunting. And working from the right-hand side backwards, you can see that infant health contributes, childcare at the top contributes, all the way over to the left. These are all the different factors that you could kind of, off the top of your head, guess might be relevant. Next. And what our work does is it shows you where the shared values of the society might influence it. Next. Yeah, and it starts to get a bit more precise. So we can see that Islamic education is obviously incredibly important to these people, and that can directly influence these factors. Next. And so you actually can put this into your modeling in terms of cultural determinants, which have some influence on the more physical ones towards stunting. So this is what we're kind of working through the data now and getting a bit more clarity on. So in terms of data, you've got two things happening. You've got your profile on the left, your kind of portrait, and you've got your focus group transcription, which has loads and loads of details depending on what you've asked, what questions you've asked. Now, for those of you doing urban work or work anywhere else, climate change, we can do all sorts of things with these two types of data. So for example, we've looked at climate change perspectives in Shanghai and Vienna. And so you get the framework and narrative of the shared values, and we ask them information on how do you think you could be impacted by climate change? And the shared values goes up into the upper diagram, into the middle, where it says cultural shared values. So you can get 8 groups, assimilate the 8 groups, and produce a kind of cultural schema of the shared values of those groups. And then you collect all the information from the PECs, which, as I said, are kind of the focus groups, in terms of, well, what would bother you so much about climate change that you might leave? And what attracts you to the city so much that you wouldn't leave? So it's kind of livability. Next. And you get something like this. You get the cultural themes in the middle, and you get actual linkages between those cultural themes and things that would cause them to stay or to leave. And so this is an example for Vienna. So in Vienna, in the cultural values, you can see in the middle, let me see, kind of slightly to the right, is good and just social care and safety. So it was very important. A theme coming out in the cultural themes of Vienna was that they really wanted social justice. It was very important to them. And then they also wanted, right next to it, firm pathways to sustainability and long-term thinking. They wanted to see the government making very concrete steps towards sustainability, or they would be off. They would, well, here it's just a shared value. If we look up at the higher desirable elements coming from the focus groups, there were lots and lots of statements about the need for green urban spaces, the need to be able to get out to the mountains and see the mountains, scenic landscapes. And on the left to that, you see 2.1, excellent public transport and great green transport. So the kind of things that made these people said would want them to live in Vienna was a really good green transport system. And they were very excited that it was about to be extended to the outer parts of the city. But if the extension of this green transport system would mean that it was too expensive for the less wealthy members of the city to use it, at the bottom, you could see there's inequality and instability. If they felt that social justice was being thwarted by the price of this green public transport, they said very clearly they'd be gone. They would go and live somewhere else because they were not going to live in a city which couldn't have manifest social justice. So we can, yeah, you didn't see this in Shanghai. You saw really quite different things in Shanghai. I don't think we have Shanghai here. Okay, so this, you can analyze this kind of data in all sorts of ways. So there's a lot of literature at the moment on different types of infrastructures, because the city modelers are looking at resilience and infrastructure in different ways, and they tend to model it differently. So the governance infrastructure people model it differently to the grey infrastructure, and then they say, oh, we have really quite a lot of difficulty integrating our different resiliences. How do we model integrated resilience? And we said, well, why don't you do it the other way around? Why don't we figure out what integrated resilience really is by starting from the center, which is what people care about. And there's even a concept that hadn't been developed, which is called the desirable state. The desirable state of a city is the one in which people, well, it's got to be desirable or people won't stay there. It should also be desirable in terms of energy provision and water and stuff like that. But it fundamentally has to be desirable. And the people who decide that are the people. So if you put cultural shared values at the center, you can then, and then you also know how people would drift away from the city and into the city. You actually have defined your desirable state. Next. So you can put all this data together, and then at the top here, you can see the urban subsystem linkages that some of the modelers like. I don't know if this interests you, the one at the top. So different types of modelers in Shanghai is a big thing. A lot of people we work in offices nearby like to model ins and outs of cities, and you can literally put weightings in and linkages because we can actually see what they're linked to. They're linked to the cultural values of the people. So it's another way of looking at systems. Yeah, next. And this is the kind of thing we've done. We're working in 3 sites in the UK at the moment at infrastructure needs. This is for North Norfolk. So we've got the cultural shared values. I'm sorry, I don't have the linkages here. You've got the whole center part is the desirable states of the settlements. And then we can also talk about on the right, the perceived risks that these people have for climate change. This actually was about not just climate change, but coastal erosion. So the perceived risks can be put on the right, and the actions that they think are reasonable for this risk. And what you have now is a profile. You have a profile of the whole area in terms of their cultural values, what they consider the desirable state, the perceived risks, and the actions that they think are reasonable. Now, I'm not saying this defines everything, but if you are a government trying to write a policy, it tells you an awful lot. It tells you an awful lot. And more importantly, it shows you the linkages to them. So we're just kind of trying to figure out where we could publish this without having to digest an entire textbook of another subject first. Yeah, we're working on that. I think really I would probably stop there. I think that's a good place to stop. Maybe you can just zip down to 5 actually. We won't go into the transformations. As we do this work, we get transformations. Just keep going. Okay, so not very much further. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So next. So we've done this in lots of countries with lots of different groups, not just villages. We've done it with businesses, multinational companies, a big variety. Yeah. And it's got lots of uses, and I've given you some. We looked at legacies. It does a very good job looking at social legacies. We did the Happy Village program in Thailand. We were working with Melbourne School of Design on neighborhood planning, collective action in a village, and so on. Okay, next. And we just like some collaborators really, and just to tie the story back to the beginning. On the left here, you can see ESG. ESG is an international way of evaluating environment, social, and governance. And there are some standard indexes like the Bloomberg, MSCI, HKX, and so on. And as I said, they're very biased and they only measure certain things. And so on the right, we talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative. And those companies really, really want something that can tell them more about the problems they might face with the people. And so the two have an overlap in terms of the people delivery nexus is missing in terms of the indicators. And so we'd like to see whether we can continue to develop what we're doing to the point where it can contribute to this And I think my eye is not on sustainable development, but on the much bigger concept of ecological civilization, and ask the question, could we have a new system of indicators, which is the same as saying an entirely new economics, new form of economics, which a lot of other people are already working on. But I think those people have given up on social indicators. But the ecosystem services people and the relational values people, they're working on something really overlaps with us hugely. And we want to know, can we work out some indicators on a whole new framework, which doesn't start with the $sign and then try and fit the rest in, but it starts as an ecology, and the ecology being centered on people. David Cameron announced last Monday, a week ago today, his new aid policy. He said he's going to increase the amount of money given to international aid again, but he says this time it's got to be linked to what people want. And I'm really curious to know what he thinks, how he's going to find that out. And the urgency comes from something like that, and also on the China side, something called the Global Civilization Initiative. And if you haven't heard of it, I think you really, any of you working in international development, you really should maybe look this up. It's moderately recent, it's about 6 or 7 months old. If you look at the bottom 4 points, the Global Civilization Initiative is one of 3 main pillars of China's, if you like, their modern day constitution. You could think of it that way. It's a new pillar to China's constitution, if you want to think of it. That's how my simple mind thinks of it. And at the bottom right, at the bottom, it tells you the GCI advocates the respecting of the diversity of world civilizations. This is China talking. The promotion of the common values of all mankind, attaching importance to civilization, inheritance, and innovation. So they're basically saying Belt and Road country development from now on has to acknowledge there is another culture, and it has a legacy, and it needs to be protected. And this is completely new concepts, as far as I can see, for China. And it's going to be an incredibly big step if they make it. And it's going to be very uncomfortable while they make it, I think. But I'm so proud to be even a tiny bit related to anything going on in this area. And I hope it works. But if you haven't heard of it, you should go and find out about it. It's really quite eye-watering. Yeah. And I think that's where I'm going to stop. Yeah. We love to hear about ideas for collaboration. Go down 1 or 2 more, there'll be a photo. Yeah. Oh, you want to hear about the transformation? Yes, I can tell you more about transformation. Let's just give everybody a little pause for a moment. And then if you've got time, Romina, I'll then talk a little bit more about the transformations. Christine, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting method and way that you are working. We are now just sending a project to work with indigenous Amazonian populations also in Bolivia. We until now worked with the Quechua, so like with the majority indigenous population, that's very different. And I am interested to know a bit more about the method, about how to work. I also, from experience, I'm working with people that are often illiterate, or at least like 10% of the people we work with are illiterate, is their strong knowledge and their strong organization skills, and also to have another perception of knowledge than our Western vision on what knowledge is. That's something I would maybe want to explore.
The method does work with illiterate people. We use a bingo card with numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and we read out the indicators, and they circle the ones that have a phrase in them that they want to come back to, and then we come back and discuss it. So it absolutely works, yeah, with illiterate people.
Yeah. We were wanting to introduce also in that project like PhD students. We are working with 2 departments, with social sciences and with nursery, with those 2 faculties in Bolivia. And yeah, I think it can be something to consider, maybe as related to one of the PhDs, because it can be a pre-field work. We in our field work, we go to the sites, we be or there a day or 2 days, and we do like a diagnosis, also directly consultations, that we really create also community with them. The strength of Bolivia is that they are very well organized. So all Bolivia is organized from the bottom up to the top. So there's no decision that is made without authorization of the lowest step. So I think it's a very interesting context also to work what you're working on. So
our biggest problem is that it takes about 10 or 12 workshops before a new facilitator is confident enough to take their own workshop. So what we normally recommend is maybe one of our facilitators just comes and keeps doing workshops until the local facilitators are ready. We've done this in Indonesia with fantastic success, and India, and the local researchers can do it now. And we just did it in Nepal, and we left two qualified people there. Yeah, so a PhD student would be great. They might have to come and visit us for a bit, or we might need to spend time with them. But what we're doing now is we're going to publish 2 open access books in the next kind of 6 months, maybe. One will be a handbook, and one will be a academic theoretical underpinning book, and they'll be open access. And we haven't got a website properly running yet. We hope to do that moderately soon.
Okay, thank you very much. The only one needs a Spanish-speaking facilitator who comes here, because English is a problem.
We have somebody who's a native Spanish speaker who could possibly come, but we may as well just work with some of your own team and let them take it forward themselves after they're trained. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe Anthony requested this last slide on China.
Yeah, sure. Go up a few slides.
Will you be able to share the slides?
Yes, certainly, no problem. Yeah, there you go. Well, I'm not sure which one they want, this one or the other one.
And we have Claire's now.
Yeah, Claire, you had a question?
Yeah, no, I just had I had a quick, thank you so much for this, Mari. What, do you want to go back to that slide though? Were you going to discuss
Somebody asked for it. We're just they wanted to copy
Right.
some of it.
Oh, right. Oh, Mari, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for sort of weaving in and getting the story of the hub in there. I guess I have one question for you about sort of changes over time. And have you seen a lot of changes when you go back to these communities? And what, in your opinion, is the big driver to change around these values, or do they? How do you yeah, what's your thoughts on that?
Okay, so are you talking about their values changing, or are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about like how like obviously when you come into a group and you're talking, things maybe have very different priorities. So you may be getting values around very different kinds of priorities at the community level. So how do you sort of, and equally the people that come to a group, I mean, we know from sort of the old participatory work that we would often get, dominant voices, and your work kind of ameliorates that. But I was just wondering what your thoughts on change were.
We've gone back to some groups. I don't know how many we've done, because it's actually quite hard to get sometimes to get the funding or the opportunity to go back. But whenever we have gone back, people tell us, I mean, some of the first things we ask them is, which of these have changed? And we generally get the answer that they haven't. So 3 months, 6 months later, they're usually pretty much the same. You'd need a really huge event like a pandemic to shift somebody's values enough that it would shift in the framework, or more likely, they've shifted the group and the group has new members or something like that. But generally speaking, the values stay the same. Of course, what this means is it's very important to choose the groups that are important for your research question. Otherwise, you're not getting the input that you need. So for the questions on climate change in a city, we had to think about what types of people that naturally collect together anyway. What range of people, and how would we choose groups that would span the range of people we thought would have different opinions about climate change. So we looked at, older people, younger people who are more globalized, people who own a home. So we had to decide how the sampling should be done. In the stunting hub, obviously, we're looking at all the people, stakeholder groups that are affiliated with the environment of a child. So you have to choose those groups well. But the groups themselves don't change their values as such. What happens, I skipped a section, section 4 on transformation. What happens, and this example comes from rural Mexico, where we did our early work, is we would go back and say, we've got some questions for you. 6 months later, can we have a chat? And they said, well, yes, but we don't have that NGO anymore. And it's like, what do you mean? And they said, well, in the workshop, we realized that we're not actually interested in emotional connection of children to nature as much as we're interested in empowerment. And since we realized we're interested in empowerment, we now work with women. And we've given that NGO to somebody else who takes very good care of the children. So what happens is people suddenly are so aware of what was already there. But they're suddenly so aware that the next day they'll go and change their website or change their strategy or agree a new one. And so you have a transformational effect, but they still say the values are the same. The values on the table stay the same, but the way they act can change.
Thank you, Mari. That's great. Thanks very much.
I have a question in chat. Is there any specific space we can follow your updates in?
Yes, I guess if you send in your email address, I think we're going to start a mailing list. That's probably the best thing. And then we gave some talks at LSE about a week ago, and they're adamant that they want us there. This is in the Public Policy Institute? Yes. Sorry, this is so far out of my comfort zone. Global Policy Institute. They've got an LSE Fudan University hub, and they want us to come back in January and run a couple of days of training. So if anybody wants to leave their email address, we'll start a mailing list so that people. It's been so rare to have opportunities where people could train, but we might be having some during the next 6 months. Yeah. And of course, we still have to do our field work in Senegal and continue more field work in India. And so we can speak with the hub teams there to see what opportunities they would like us to provide, or they will provide for us to train. We're very happy to try and train people as much as possible.
Well, I think Anthony wanted to see the previous slide about ESG, where it introduced the different concepts that it had. Could you go back to that one? The first slide about ESG. The very first one. Yeah, where it says the different
ESG.
parts. Yeah.
Ecological
civilization. Ah, right.
No, the very first maybe 10 or 12, I think, where Mary shows the EC concept, I think. The very beginning. Right.
But that was ESG, not ecological civilization.
No, you have one for ecological civilization, like a flower map. Close, getting close. Very close. Before, yeah. Somewhere near the SORI or something.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Oh, this one. Sorry. Yeah, it's my mistake.
No, down
one.
That one. No.
Up
two. There you go. That was it. Okay, well done. Yeah. Okay, some email addresses. We'll get that. Yeah. And anybody who wants to do longer term collaboration, do let me know, because we've got so much data that we could write so many papers with, and we're just writing. I think we had 11 papers on the go this year, at least 12
in different disciplines.
It is so hard work. So if you think you can write the introduction, we can give you all the inside part. You write the introduction and conclusion for that field, and we've got a great partnership.
Basically, not different discipline, but different application contexts. Like,
it's sometimes application, but what happens is in most cases we've ended up contributing to the business theories.
Yeah.
So we've contributed to Mesereau's transformational learning, to Polanyi's personal knowledge theory, to Nonaka's Seki, to this one,
They're like integrated resilience is really.
urban planning, urban resilience, and oh my goodness, design, participatory methods. I give up. Business, transformational leadership,
Transformational leadership, that's it. Organizational
change. Some of the areas we published in health. There's Annabelle, yes. And I think we're going to have a nice paper eventually on cultural schema, right? And what is the one about interventions?
It's about cultural protocols, social acceptability.
Social acceptability for interventions. Intervention science, not quite, kind of
Implementation science.
implementation science that they don't necessarily want to call what we do implementation science, do they? But it is. Yeah. A new form of implementation science.
It's just very, for me, it's been really interesting because we're doing like the parallel work.
Yes.
Very much so. We had talking about having mobility. We started first conversation for we want a metro project. I mean, they haven't got any money. They got no money at all. But anyway, but then the workshop, and this was done by the Cuban facilitators, right? People from the university who actually have grown up in the area.
Yeah.
So they were partners themselves, which was a great help.
Right.
And they started by framing the workshop as La ciudad que queremos, the city that we want and love. It's the same word.
Nice. Yeah.
So what we're looking for in the city, and so that they kind of
So it's very, very related to what we're doing.
and so then people say, well, we want safe city, we want clean city, we want all of the lovely things, and they say, okay, next bit. What kind of ability do you need to do that? And of course, you move from a metro system to not having things on the pavement that you have to walk around, get your shoes dirty. And so that kind of, and I think we had people in the room from the Transport Authority who told us that their own views were very much changed. It was very interesting what happened after that. So you get a lot of people who are thinking differently and have that conversation. The conversation sharpens the way people think. And then the next stage was, okay, they did need to raise some money. And there's no money in the domestic, they're really up against it. The EU brought in money, they brought in their own consultants who produced a report which is so significant. It was just like they typics out one country and put another country. It was just and the people at the university have been sidelined, so the Transport Authority have been moved by the people who brought the money and the consultancy and international travel and all the rest of it. And they took it away from the university. They were completely sidelined. And I think that was kind of a very interesting question.
One of the things that happened when we were talking to Melbourne School of Design is they had a couple of meetings which involved lots and lots of town planners. And the town planners grabbed the idea, but what they liked was this. What they liked was that our portraits were completely linkable to the groups that came. So the whole thing was auditable because the city was getting sued sometimes for designing parks and things that then other people said was not what they wanted. And this way they envisaged that they could have workshops in different parts of different neighborhoods and be able to show that using shared values as the decision basis would lead to actual architectural elements that fulfillment of the shared values requirements, but without people, you don't ask people, do you want a park bench and do you want a fountain? They say things like, I don't want explicit advertising nearby, and I want my own relatives to be safe, so they give you principles and then you can do it. But what they liked was the fact is they would be able to show every step of their decision making back to the groups. So this might be something for your situation.
It was interesting, to make it more assertive, basically.
Yes.
Yes. To assert that this is the way that we can make decisions and not just follow the money or follow the
and I think that's why we're now thinking harder about that this is not just a nice way to get a portrait of people, but it's a way for people to say, this is our voice. I mean, in Botswana, when we worked with those villages, we had one village group that kind of phoned and followed my researcher around and they said, look, could you come back, please? And we often get people saying, but when are you coming back? Because the district office keeps saying they want us to come for training on climate change adaptation. But we want to tell them, we know more about it than they do now. Can you ask them to let us present? We want to present. And they were asking our researchers, so they were much more clear about what they wanted to say.
My other question is, I mean, in terms of getting people, local people, I mean, in Cuba, of course, they've got loads of universities and they've got, I mean, so they don't have that problem, but I mean, that's really helpful to have people who are, you know, on the ground and committed to participation.
They don't need to be academics.
But they, yeah, so
They don't need to be academics, but we do find that business consultants who do a lot of consultancy generally can never train more. They never have, I don't think we've had one yet make it to be a facilitator because they have their own way of thinking about what they're doing with the group and it doesn't work. So a local person is much better. Yeah. Boundary spanner, so to speak.
yeah.
We have a couple of points.
Yeah.
in Chat.
One
is.
how to do quality control. Quality control is a really good question, brilliant question. You know, there's kind of an ethical question too, because you're taking these people into their tacit zone and they're a little bit vulnerable then, and then you're getting stuff out. So somebody should be checking the ethics. For example, if you run out of time and you don't make the framework at the end, the people will be really frustrated and really kind of tense, and they will not have had a good experience. And you just need to put 10 minutes in to let them make the framework, and they just suddenly, all this messy stuff that they've been talking about for an hour and a half is on the table, and they feel good. They feel there's a very positive feeling resulting. So there's an ethical question on quality, and then there's also, we haven't worked out quality control. It's one of the main reasons we haven't scaled out yet, actually. And we're still not quite sure how to do it. So it's a really good question, but I will tell you that if people don't pay attention and really try and get it right, you're going to end up with some unhappy participants. And they will be your quality control, but how to prevent it to begin with is
feel when you did it wrong.
Thank you for the question. And then Anthony, beyond GDP, yeah. Okay, right, we'll have to look that one up. This is beyond Marilyn Waring glass.
Yeah, I wrote it down.
Yeah, thank you, yeah. Interest to collaborate in primary healthcare, great, and COs.
Question.
Great. Anthony, yeah. Go ahead with your question, Anthony. Yeah, can't hear you. Is the sound down?
It's working fine. We work, yeah.
I can't hear you, Anthony.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Well, good, thank you. Yeah, I was just going to say, Marilyn Waring is an interesting person. She was a politician and she was an economist. And the book Counting for Nothing, I think, was around about early 2000s. And it made quite an impact at the point where before the report of Amartya Sen and Joe Stiglitz and so on. So she had quite an impact, I think, amongst various circles around what is and isn't counted in GDP and how things that people value are not counted in public policy making, where public policy making is too focused on dollars and so on.
I mean, the idea that the idea that economics is missing stuff has been around for a while. There's a new economics foundation here in London, which is done some pretty good stuff. The question really is how to take it forward. And that's why I've been a little bit slow to bring out our work until it's more ready. But I think we're getting close now. Because it's really hard to make it work in the real world reliably. And this whole question of if it's all down to a facilitator, you know, how do you get a quality control? And it boils down to that right now, actually. The other in ecosystem services is a field which is burgeoning at the moment because of biodiversity, and they've done a lot of work on this question. The question is this: how do you decide what the value of a forest is? So you can say, well, we can count the trees and see how many kilograms of wood and how many lengths of wood we can get out of it. That's tradable in the market, so it's got a dollar sign on it. And then you could say maybe the forest provides biodiversity or something, again, which is indirectly traded in the market, and that's got a market value. And then they sort of say, well, what about people who might say, I go there to feel better, or I look at the mountain and I see the forest, and that's part of who I am. And so this has suddenly become important at the European level, and it's become recognized that starting with an economic basis, it just isn't going to work. You keep ending up having more and more and more and more categories to cover cultural, and you just need kind of anything converted to a dollar sign for the others. And so they've really done a lot of work, and we can tie into the literature quite well. They're now talking about relational values, which is the value of nature to a human, which still doesn't work because in many cultures there's no separation. In Bolivia, for example, I suspect you'll find people don't talk about nature separately to the person. And so how can you put it into a framework that does that? So we're very interested in these things, but it's quite hard to make it work in practice. Yeah, but we're getting there.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's great to hear there's some progress being made, and thank you also for letting me what you said earlier around Tim Jackson, because in Marilyn Waring's class she mentioned the UK was quite a leader on sustainable development initiatives, and that was around about 2005, and maybe it was when Tim Jackson's progress was making some progress.
Yeah,
and then I wondered, I came over here for a while about 2013, and it seemed to have all stopped. And I didn't know why. And I guess what you said before, obviously, big change of direction, perhaps with change of governments and things in around 2010 or whatever. Yep.
What's just a second? What
Thank
guys? Do you remember what Tim Jackson's publication is that we use so much? Is it
The prosperity without growth is another one.
Oh, that's his book. Yeah, so he wrote a book, but in the basis of prosperity without growth. But the basis of the book was a whole platform of research projects that he carried out, which showed this. And he's got a report. I can't remember. It was 2005. It was printed in 2005. You've got to look up SDC, Sustainable Development Commission, which has been disbanded, but they still have possibly a legacy website with a lot of his reports on it. And he still is a professor at Surrey, but he's on much more neutral stuff.
Okay, thank you. I'll look that up, and also I'll look up the China's ecological civilization. That looked interesting as well.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to collaborating sometime with you. That'd be great.
Will be. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think we should wrap up. It's been a long session and really, really fun. I've enjoyed talking with all of you. Please do send some more. Oh, we've got some more comments. Yeah, please keep sending comments, and then we can we'll collect them all and have a look through them.
Claire, do you wanna give a closing comment?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mara. That was super, absolutely really brilliant. And we know we'll have you back soon, I hope. And thank you very much for this afternoon. Great.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
No worries.
Thanks.